Let's begin with a quiz. Who was the first Prime Minister of independent India? Easy, right? Okay, who was the first Home Minister of Free India? Again, it should be easy. But do you know who was India's first Home Secretary? Or India's first Cabinet Secretary? If you're a quizzer, maybe. Otherwise, chances are you don't. It's an unfortunate reality of our history. We only see politicians as the makers of modern India, not civil servants or bureaucrats or the good old babus. Now, don't get me wrong, the leaders deserve the spotlight. Most of it would not have been possible without them. But they alone did not make our country. The foundations were also laid by our civil servants, some foreign, some Indian. They advised the ministers and politicians. They ran day-to-day affairs. They put new systems and checks in place. So today, we are bringing you their story. The story of the unsung makers of modern India. Time for a flashback. Our story doesn't start at independence. It begins around 200 years before that. The British East India Company was capturing power in India. They needed bureaucrats, people to run their growing empire. So the company created the CCS, or the Covenanted Civil Service. Your merit did not really matter. The company's directors would choose you. Once picked, you would sail down to India. But by the 1850s, things changed. A civil service commission was set up in London. From 1855, regular exams were held. If you cracked that, you would get appointed. And before you think, wow, that's a lot like today, it wasn't. The exams were only held in London. The syllabus was mostly European classics. So for most Indians, it was a non-starter. Nonetheless, some did crack this elite test. The first Indian in the Indian civil services was Satyendranath Tagore. He was the brother of Rabindranath Tagore. He cracked the test in 1864. 3 years later, 4 others also succeeded. But these men were the exceptions. The norm was white British civil servants. By 1883, there were just 12 Indians in the civil service, the Indian civil service. By 1915, it was 63. The rest were all Europeans. The largely white bureaucracy ruled over the 250 million Indians. It was unfair, but then again, what would you expect? It was the British Raj. India waited a long time for the civil services exam to be held at home. It finally happened after the First World War. From 1922, exams were held in Allahabad. Later, Delhi also became a center. Now, this was important because the test became more accessible to Indians. More Indians could write it, so more Indians could become civil servants in their own country. Eventually, they began acing it. Subhash Chandra Bose, for example, stood 4th in the 1920 batch. He also reported for his training. But the next year, in 1921, he resigned, and we all know what happened next. Same story with police officers. Most of them were Europeans. Until 1931, only 20% of the posts were filled by Indians. This would change around the beginning of the Second World War. Now, why did I tell you this long backstory? Because the past is crucial to understand the present and the future. India's civil service was not made for Indians. It was made for the British, much like the Indian Railways or the Post. Don't think of these European officers as loyal to India. They were the embodiment of Imperial Britain. As someone once said to Jawaharlal Nehru, they were neither Indian, nor civil, nor servants. So even at independence, the civil service retained those characteristics, at least some of them. Let's look at pre-partition India in 1947. We had 980 civil service officers. 468 of them were Europeans, so around 47% of them. The rest were Indians. 352 Hindus, 101 Muslims, 25 Indian Christians, 13 Parsis and 10 Sikhs. After partition, the service was split. India created the Indian Administrative Service, IAS. Pakistan created the Pakistan Administrative Service. Both still exist. Their officers became the backbone of these new countries. In India, the politicians realized one thing, good or bad, you needed the civil servants, especially Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. This was a speech to the Constituent Assembly. There is no alternative to this administrative system. The union will go. You will not have a united India if you do not have good all India services. It tells you how important they were. We say Sardar Patel united India, but he himself said the civil services kept India united. So what exactly did they do? Well, the roles were split into different jobs. Some of them served in the central department, the central government, as secretaries or joint secretaries. Others served in the judicial side of things, basically in courts. They could become a district judge or a judge at the state high court. And finally, some served in the states as district collectors or assistant commissioners. They kept the wheels running. While politicians made grand plans, these civil servants steadied the ship, and it was no easy task. Most of the European officers left after 1947. They either retired or joined the British civil service, but a handful did stay behind. Meet J.P.L. Gwynne. He served in Free India's Board of Revenue until 1968. He was the last British citizen from the Indian civil services. By the late 1970s, most of these men had retired or left. The ICS had given way to the IAS. The last officer was Nirmal Kumar Mukherjee. He retired as Cabinet Secretary in 1980. He was India's final ICS officer, the end of an era, I guess. Many of these officers laid the foundation for so many things around us, things that we now take for granted, like elections. India's first general election was held in 1951. It was conducted by this man, Sukumar Sen. He joined the Indian Civil Service in 1921. During the election, he was Chief Secretary of West Bengal. He was sent on deputation as the Chief Election Commissioner of India. You think elections are complicated now? Just imagine the situation in 1951. Around 85% of the country could not read or write. So how was this election held? Using symbols. Sukumar Sen published a report on the entire process. It reveals the work that went into it, the number of people involved. And let me tell you, it's mind-boggling. You need different people in different roles to conduct these elections. You need electoral registration officers. They fill up the voters list. You need returning officers who take nominations and declare results. You also need presiding officers, the people who will be in charge of polling stations. In 1952, all of this was done by civil servants. More than 1,600 registration officers were appointed. They were mainly collectors, deputy collectors, and tehsildars. Around 1,200 were appointed as returning officers. These were commissioners and collectors. And finally, the presiding officers. India had more than 132,000 polling stations. 132,000. Who would be in charge of them? Sukumar Sen and his team came up with a solution. Only government employees with a monthly salary of 60 rupees or more would be appointed, no non-officials. If there was a shortage, teachers would be called in. And even today, India follows this system. It was a wise decision made by India's civil servants. They understood how important the first election was. Too important to trust non-officials with it. Thus, a precedent was set. More than 300,000 police officers were also deployed. There's a reason we focused on the election, because that is the beating heart of India's democracy. Had we failed in 1951, there's no saying what would have happened. Many newspapers called it a huge gamble, but it paid off. And we have our government servants to thank for that. The collectors, the tehsildars, the commissioners, many nameless faces. If you Google India's 1951 election, none of them will pop up. It's all about the politicians and their parties. I guess that hasn't changed even now, but it's important that we remember and honor them, especially now. The civil services are under constant criticism today. The word bureaucracy has actually become negative. It's almost synonymous with roadblocks. Perhaps we are too harsh, or perhaps our civil servants have also lost their way. They laid the foundation of modern India. They presided over a bloody partition and the birth of a new nation. They traveled the world as diplomats and envoys. Those civil servants were not just wheels on which India moved forward, they were also engines that pushed us along. This Independence Day, let's honor those unsung heroes.